Dobro večer, dobrodošli na tribinu. Isus koji je radni naslov? Isus kroz oči žene. U Novome Zavetu pozdravljamo vas sve, dobrodošli. Radujemo se što je sa nama ovdje naša gošća iz Velsa, En, njeno prezime Braun, da, En Braun. Ona će se predstaviti, nećemo, kao što smo je najavili, nećemo imati prevod, tako da ona će se truditi da ne govori prebrzo. Imat ćemo malo i muzike sa gornje sale, ali dobro.
To je sa trga Republike.
A sa trga? Aha. U svakom slučaju dobrodošli. Ovo je uvek neiscrpna tema o kojoj se stalno priča od kako je Novi Zavet postoji. Tako da verujem da ćemo imati i večeras nešto da naučimo. And welcome to Belgrade.
Thank you.
Now it's your turn.
Okay.
Da, htjela sam i to da kažem da posle predavanja imat ćemo mogućnost da postavimo pitanja i da malo porazgovaramo sa našom govornicom.
Thank you. Well, I don't know what Melita said, but but it's great to be here. And the topic is Jesus through the lens of women. Somebody's already asked me what that means, but it basically is through the eyes of women. Now, I can see somebody's taking photographs. The only thing is, no, it's fine. Let me just explain. Some of them are copyright. The ones that are from museums, it's fine to show them somewhere like this, but, you know, they couldn't be circulated. So I just warn you. Well, I hope you're going to enjoy this, and please don't feel that you know, if you don't understand something, I realise that in a second language it can be a challenge, and if you want to ask something about if the paintings are unusual, you know, maybe you haven't really looked at art much before, but please just ask. You know, you don't just have to sit there and, please enjoy it. Right, now some people argue that the Christian church, or Christianity, has an essentially negative view of women. And so to dispel that, what I hope to do this evening is to zoom in on the portrayals of women in the Gospels. Women, as you probably know, have often been erased from history, but that's not true in the Gospels, and it's exciting to see just how visible women are in these accounts. And their inclusion is really significant because Jesus is the heart of the biblical story, and in his behaviour we can expect to find the Christian attitude to women most clearly expressed. The way that Jesus treated women is absolutely pivotal. So, how are his interactions with women depicted in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, which draw on the eyewitness accounts of women, and in the artwork that depict their stories? Now, I've attempted to be inclusive in my choice of female as well as male artists to illustrate this talk. Initially, it wasn't very easy because for centuries, social constraints meant that women didn't have access to basic artistic training. But some made it despite the obstacles. So what I'd like to do is introduce you briefly to a couple that I'll mention. This is one, Lavinia Fontana, born in Bologna in 1552, taught by her father Prospero. She's probably the first professional woman painter to run her own studio. She had very prestigious commissions and actually became really quite wealthy. She was married to a painter, but he was less successful. So he ran the household and took care of the children, of whom there were 11. I thought you might be impressed by that. And then the next one is Artemisia Gentileschi. She was born a little bit later, 1593. She was also trained by her father, Orazio, in Rome, and she was the first woman to enter the Florence Academy of Arts and Drawing in 1616. I think this self-portrait shows just how accomplished she was as an artist. If you imagine, are any of you artists? Yeah, great. So you'll realize how difficult it is to paint oneself like that. And she's painted herself as the personification of painting. So sleeves rolled up, paint-stained hands, hair dishevelled, concentrated on her painting. In an interview in 2002, Paula Rego, the Portuguese-British artist, who some of you may have heard of, spoke about the challenge of painting a biblical subject in an original way that is meaningful to a contemporary audience. And one of her paintings demonstrates how she attempted to do this. It's a contemporary nativity, and the model for the Virgin Mary is her granddaughter, and she's included Portuguese onlookers rather than the shepherds. An exhibition to celebrate International Women's Day in 2023 responded with enormous enormous enthusiasm to that challenge. Perhaps I should explain. Last year, the theme of International Women's Day in Britain was Embrace Equity. I don't know if it was the same here, because I think sometimes there's a variation between countries. But there were a group of women who decided to put on an exhibition celebrating women in the Bible, and they called it Biblical Women Equity, ? And they put out an open call for work and got responses not just from the local area but from different parts of Britain. So most of the contemporary art that I've included was produced for that exhibition. Now, I'd like to get inside the stories of some of the women in the Gospels who are depicted in the works of art. How have these Gospels come down to us? Well, Luke, at the beginning of his Gospel, the Gospel writer Luke tells us how he approached writing his Gospel. He says that many have undertaken to draw up an account of things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account. So he makes it very clear that, like the other writers, he draws on eyewitness testimonies from people who knew Jesus personally and witnessed the events recorded. And if you read Luke's Gospel, I'm sorry about these. It looks as if this will go on forever. Don't worry about the size of the notes that I've got there. It's because I really should wear reading glasses, but if I wear reading glasses, I can't see you. So I've printed it in very large font. So what I was going on to say, that you really get the impression, if you read Luke's Gospel, that some women must have been among his sources, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, because he records how she felt, what she thought, and what she said. Well, how does Jesus appear through the eyes of the other women in the Gospels? Perhaps one of the most surprising interactions was between Jesus and a woman from Nablus in the West Bank. In the first century, it was known as Sychar in Samaria, and tensions were very high in that area, as they are now. And this is a painting from Rembrandt's workshop, which heightens the drama of the meeting between Jesus and this Samaritan woman through the contrasting light and dark. Now, the most startling aspect of this encounter is that it took place at all. There was deep animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans for historical, racial, and religious reasons. It was unusual for a Jew to converse with, at any length with a Samaritan. From the perspective of a first century Jewish rabbi, this woman was unclean. Jesus is resting alone by the well at midday. You can see him in silhouette just on the right of the painting. Actually, do you need to put one of the lights down? Can you see these paintings okay? Is it okay? Can you see at the back? Yeah? Good. So Jesus is resting. His disciples have gone into the town to buy food. And unusually, a lone woman arrives to collect water at the hottest time of day. And Jesus deliberately breaks with convention by initiating a conversation and asking her for a drink. And she's shocked. She says, "You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan. How can you ask me for a drink?" In the eyes of a devout Jewish man at the time, Jesus, she knew, would be polluting himself by drinking from the same cup. John, who records this story, tells us that the disciples, who can be seen just about in the foreground, bottom left, they're coming back from buying food, and they're equally surprised when they find Jesus talking in private with a woman. In their eyes, this is completely inappropriate behavior. They reflect the prejudices of the time. And I think that Rembrandt, or the painter, it was his, whoever it was, in his workshop, seems to indicate this, because you can see a disciple staring in consternation. What's he doing? Actually, I was struck this afternoon because we went to have a look at the St. Sava's temple, and down in the crypt there, there's a depiction of Mary Magdalene, not Mary Magdalene, sorry, the woman at the well and Jesus. And what's so interesting is the depiction of the disciples who were looking really shocked at what's going on. I wish I had an image of it. I didn't have time to take a photograph and put it in. Just to indicate how shocking it was, some rabbis of the day advised that a rabbi should not talk with a woman on the street, not even with his own wife. The Samaritan woman is the last person with whom any respectable rabbi should be speaking. I'm sorry, this is annoying me. I'm going to pull these notes apart, I think, because it's just getting in such a mess. Right, let's see if that's better. This is how Lavinia Fontana depicts the same event. And you can see she gives us a slightly different interpretation. Does that strike anybody as, maybe you don't want to say, but if you want to say anything about the paintings, do. But if you look at the woman, what Fontana seems to be indicating is that she's alarmed by this conversation. If you look at her left hand outstretched, look at her body language. She's brought Jesus and the Samaritan woman right into the foreground of the composition. She seems to be asking us, or inviting us to eavesdrop on their conversation. She's depicted Jesus as seeming very fatigued and hardly having the strength to lift his head. And Fontana has placed a water jug right in the centre of the composition, very prominently, to emphasise that the conversation at the well revolves around physical and spiritual thirst. And this is a wonderful painting by Artemisia Gentileschi. It was recently discovered. And here the Samaritan woman seems much more relaxed. She's seated on the edge of the well and she's listening attentively. And this well-side discussion develops into the longest recorded private conversation in the Gospels, and it's with a woman. I think I'll say that again in case you didn't get it in a second language. The longest recorded private conversation that we have is with a woman. The woman is persistent in her interrogation, and Jesus responds to her searching questions as she dialogues with him and tries to identify who is this stranger sitting on the well. All three painters have paid very careful attention to the text in John's Gospel, but the treatment of Fontana and Gentileschi is distinctive, it seems to me. Both women painters portray the Samaritan as actively engaged in dialogue rather than objectifying her, as some male painters have tended to do. And this lengthy conversation demonstrates the extent to which Jesus was prepared to break with convention and to offer a marginalized woman the tantalizing prospect of living water that would well up to eternal life. This was a ceramic stoneware sculpture produced by Faye Mayo for the exhibition that I mentioned last year, called Eternal Waters. And Faye explains, I'll read it to you. Every vessel I make is intended to draw your gaze to the interior. Here you will see the bright, refreshing tones of clean, renewing water, an echo of the cleansing and washing that Jesus brings into a person's life by his sacrifice for us. And then, if you notice, can you see the gold that's rippling down into the vessel? That actually is the verse from John's Gospel. Whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become like a spring of water welling up to eternal life. I was quite disappointed because I really had hoped that Faye would be able to come with me and bring her piece of ceramic. But we didn't manage that. But it would be a great exhibition sometime. She makes some wonderful work. She's a professional ceramicist. For the first time in John's Gospel, Jesus makes himself known as the Messiah, or the deliverer, to a woman. And the woman said to him, I know that the Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, am he. On several occasions, the reactions of the male disciples and religious leaders to Jesus' behavior help us to gauge just how countercultural he was in his interactions with women. He highlights their bias and discrimination. Let me give you a few examples. We haven't got time to go through them all, but for instance, he responds to another marginalized woman, a Syro-Phoenician, ignoring the advice of the disciples who urge him to send her away. He offends a Pharisee by allowing a notorious woman described as a great sinner to anoint him. And he clashes with a synagogue leader when he heals a woman on the Sabbath. This exchange between Jesus and the Samaritan woman isn't an isolated incident. The next piece is by Lottie Cheverton, and she was a very gifted artist. Tragically, she was killed in a car crash in 1991 with her husband. So I like showing her work to keep her memory alive. It's a relief painting. She built it up on canvas in 3 dimensions, using wood, cloth, paper, and weaving wax and fabric into it as well. And Lottie's painting takes us into a home, and 3 people are connected in conversation. Luke tells us about this gathering. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparation that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister's left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Now, if you're not familiar with that passage, I guess how you wonder Jesus responded. Did he say, "Yeah, go and give her a hand, you've been sitting here a long time"? But he didn't. He didn't say that. He said, "Martha, you're worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Well, what's going on here? The phrase "at the feet of" is very significant. I don't know if are you all understanding that? At the feet of. The Apostle Paul, for example, spoke of his education at the feet of Gamaliel. So learning from Gamaliel. And in affirming Mary's behavior, Jesus is commending her for adopting what in the first century was that the role of a male student sitting at the feet of a rabbi or teacher. So Jesus clearly broke with contemporary rabbinical tradition when he taught women. One rabbi in the Talmud makes the extraordinary statement that it's better to burn the words of the law than give them to a woman. Jesus upended first century expectations when he endorsed Mary's right to learn. This is an unknown drawing done in pen and ink. It's in the British Museum. But I think this anonymous artist has appreciated the implication of the events in Bethany. It's a contemporary Dutch setting, contemporary 17th century Dutch setting, and Martha is seated by the fire. It looks to me as if she's peeling potatoes, and Mary sits at the table absorbed in reading. And I like this painting by Lizzie Stonhold. This is her version of the event. Now, it may strike you as the background may strike you as rather unusual, but I should explain that Lizzie lives on a stretch of the Welsh coast. The rock in the background is called Church Rock. It's actually about 1.5 miles from where I was born. So I learnt to swim in that little stretch of water there. And to my mind, what Lizzie is doing in this painting is showing that Jesus' attitude to women is as relevant anywhere in the world as it was then in Bethany. And interesting, the title of it is Martha and Mary Learning from Jesus, because both women are learning. And Martha, we shouldn't think that she was neglected. She also benefited from Jesus' teaching. In another interaction, on another, well, just after the death of her brother Lazarus, she's the first to hear one of the most astounding statements in the New Testament. Jesus comforts her and says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies." Do you believe this? This is the second time, as far as we know, that Jesus makes a major self-revelation in the first instance to a woman. And in response, Martha makes one of the clearest confessions of faith in the Gospels. She says, "Yes, Lord, I believe you're the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world." The religious leaders found Jesus' acceptance of those they considered disreputable and marginal deeply offensive. One woman who appreciated their attitude was this remarkable woman, Josephine Butler. We could have had a whole evening about Josephine Butler. She was quite an extraordinary woman. Don't be deceived by that portrait. She was a force to be reckoned with. Her contemporaries spoke very highly of her. Emmeline Pankhurst was a suffragette who campaigned for votes for women. And this is what she said about Josephine. "It was 30 years ago in England that a splendid woman named Josephine Butler fought to establish an equal moral code for both sexes. She fought all her life. She was stoned. She was hooted. Her meetings were broken up. Her life was made absolutely dangerous, and yet that woman persisted." Now, that doesn't convey half of what she did, a fraction of what she did. It was worse than she says there. She was once speaking above in a hayloft, and the hay underneath was set on fire. One of the ways that she placed herself in danger was she opposed the trafficking of young girls across Europe. She was really remarkable. And in 1879, she must have been one of the first women to do this, she was speaking in Cambridge University. At the time, she was speaking to a group of all male undergraduates about the double moral standards of the day. But she says, "There stands on the page of history one marked exception, and so far as I know, only one, that of Christ." I just think that is such a wonderful statement. I think I'm going to have to repeat it. There stands on the page of history one marked exception, and so far as I know, only one, that of Christ. And then she went on to tell this story from John's Gospel about a woman caught in the act of adultery who was dragged before Jesus by the religious leaders, dragged into the temple courts. And Rembrandt portrays the tense scene in this very theatrical painting. The focal point of it, you can see, is the Pharisees' accusing finger pointing at the woman, demanding if she should be stoned according to the law. Now, the religious leaders were setting this as a trap to see if Jesus would uphold the law. Of course, they were in themselves flouting the law, because if she'd been caught in the very act of adultery, presumably the man was there too, and he should have been judged as well. But they've neglected that. Rembrandt depicts the moment of suspense when Jesus is about to pass judgment. The man in the black turban, if you can see him, he's just, you can see it's not very clear, but you see, I don't know if you can see him. the guy in the red cloak in the foreground, he's just behind him. But there's a guy with a turban who's doing this, as if he's telling everybody to be quiet, that judgment is about to be passed. And Jesus very cleverly turns the accusers into the accused by saying, let any one of you who's without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. The accusers have fallen into their own trap, and they soon slink away, beginning with the older ones. Jesus has exposed their hypocrisy and bias, and the weeping woman, caught in the diagonal shaft of light, is the one who goes away forgiven. This incident seems to have been neglected by women artists, but in the exhibition I mentioned, Pam Pickford did a triptych, a mixed media triptych, providing a female perspective. And, sorry, went the wrong way. This is one of them. And compared with Rembrandt's composed scene, hers is full of turbulence and violence. The woman's terror at the prospect of death by stoning is evident, until she hears Christ's verdict. He forgave her and saved her life, telling her to abandon her former behavior. Jesus' forgiveness is absolutely radical. The religious leaders were scandalized at the way he forgave those they thought were unforgivable. To their annoyance, Jesus repeatedly reached out to those in need, the suffering and the disabled. I'm using another of Lottie's relief paintings to illustrate the case of one woman he helped. Luke describes her as being bent over. She couldn't fully straighten herself, and she'd been like that, I think, for 12 years. I haven't got the reference there, but the synagogue leader was indignant that Jesus healed her on the Sabbath. And another desperate woman who reached out to Jesus was this one. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman was there who'd been the subject to bleeding for 12 years, and no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. This incident is the subject of Amy Jones's painting, entitled Reaching Out in Faith. Not only had the woman's affliction caused her pain and weakness, but it meant that she was effectively isolated from society, because in the first century culture she was considered to be impure and was completely isolated. And when she comes forward to identify herself, Jesus makes no mention of any impurity. He doesn't humiliate her, but simply commends her faith and confirms that she's healed. The writer Dorothy Sayers summarizes the way that Jesus was distinctive in an essay that she wrote, Are Women Human? And this is what she said. The many women who appear in the Gospels had never known a man like Jesus. There never's been such another, a prophet and a teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered, or coaxed, or patronized, who never made jokes about them, who took their questions and arguments seriously. There is no act, no sermon, no parable in the whole Gospel that borrows its pungency from female perversity. Pungency, do you know that word? Pungency, it's power. Borrows its power from perversity, foolishness. Now, it's no wonder that women flock to him. And in an absolutely unprecedented step, Jesus allowed a number of women to take to the road and follow him. Now, this is unknown. Luke tells us about this itinerant group. he says, after this, Jesus travelled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women. And he names them. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, Joanna, the wife of Chusa, the manager of Herod's household, and Susanna, and many others. I'd love to know who the many others were and how many there were. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Again, this was completely countercultural. Jesus knowingly overthrew custom when he allowed women to join his followers. And significantly, these women followed him right from the beginning until his final journey to Jerusalem. This inclusion of women, as far as I know, has been completely overlooked by artists. In the whole of the history of art, I can't find a painting, if you find one, please send it to me, of women, this itinerant group around Jesus. One of the collaborative pieces in the exhibition recognizes the many nameless women. 3 of the group, as you will have noticed, were referred to by name, but we know very little about them. There's Susanna, but we don't know any more about her. Joanna, we're told, was married to Chusa, a senior official in Herod's court. So that's from the very heart of the opposition to Jesus. She must have been a courageous woman to follow Jesus in that way. And then there was Mary Magdalene. Of course, I'm sure you recognize that name. This is the first of very few references to her in the Gospels. Later, her presence is recorded at the crucifixion. She followed to see where the body was laid, was the first to see the risen Christ, and took the news to the disciples. She was recognized as a loyal follower in the embroidered tablecloth celebrating remarkable biblical women, which is the work of Vanessa Marr. Now, Vanessa Marr is a senior lecturer in art in England. I know the organisers were absolutely thrilled when she responded to the call on the internet and sent in a piece of her work. The itinerant group of women who followed Jesus in Galilee travelled down with him from the north to Jerusalem for the Passover and were there at the crucifixion. Luke tells us all those who knew him, including the women who'd followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching. Some of those women are included in this distinctive lamentation scene created for the convent of Santa Caterina in Florence in the mid-16th century. Now, a lamentation scene isn't described in the Bible or any of the Gospels, but became popular from the 14th century onwards in Renaissance painting. I've included it because this is the work of a remarkable woman who is one of the few to be recognized. If any of you have done any art history, you may have come across Vasari's Lives of the Artists, which is a list of, well, it gives small snippets about the major Renaissance artists, and she's in it. So she was a painter, and she was a nun, and she seems to have had considerable freedom in Florence. This, I included it because it shows the raw emotional grief experienced by Christ's followers at his death. And where it was placed in the convent, it was designed so that at eye level, so that the viewers could contemplate and take in the significance of Christ's death for them. Did the women at the crucifixion appreciate why Christ was dying? It seems at this point that they didn't fully understand. As far as they were concerned, an innocent man was suffering horribly as he was tortured to death. And only later did they understand that Jesus' death had always been intended, that Jesus actually expected to die as he paid the penalty for our wrongdoing, the righteous for the unrighteous, the just for the unjust. Women were not just a fringe following. They were included in the central events of Jesus' ministry, from the manger to the cross to the empty tomb. And nowhere could Jesus' inclusion of women be more obvious than it is in the resurrection appearances. Jesus' total inclusion of women is demonstrated by the fact that the women who followed him were the first witnesses to the resurrection. This painting by Rembrandt shows us the way that the painter imagined the first Easter morning. In it, Rembrandt focuses on the account in John's Gospel. Half the painting is in shadow and half in light. The dawn is just breaking over Jerusalem. Mary Magdalene is alone. She's shocked and distraught, having just discovered that Jesus' body is missing. Rembrandt portrays her as she twists and turns and mistakes Jesus for a gardener. And he indicates Mary's mistake by depicting Jesus wearing a gardener's hat, carrying a spade, and having a pruning hook at his waist. Rembrandt has depicted Mary suspended in the moment just before recognition. I think this is what makes Rembrandt a genius, that he excels in painting these knife-edged moments. Her expression is difficult to read. She looks bewildered, distressed. At the same time, as she turns into the light, maybe there's a glimmer of hope, a dawning realization. This couldn't be Jesus, could it? Mary had seen Jesus crucified. She was there, watching the whole terrible spectacle as he was tortured and finally certified dead. She knows without a doubt that he died. A poem is attached to the back of the painting. It was written by Rembrandt's friend Jeremiah Decker, and he writes this: "Believing, though not yet with all her heart and mind, she seems poised between her joy and grief, her hope and fear." So it's a slightly different translation there. Luke tells us that when the women took the news of the empty tomb to the disciples, they didn't believe the women because their words seemed like nonsense. It's not really surprising that they were disbelieving. In a patriarchal culture like that of the first century, a woman's word carried very little weight. Their evidence was discounted in a court of law. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, wrote, "But let not the testimony of a woman be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." Levity, lightness, foolishness, flippant. So it's all the more astonishing that women were chosen as the first witnesses to the resurrection. To my mind, the testimony of the women is convincing evidence for the historicity of the resurrection. Just think about it. No first century man, even in his wildest imaginings, could have invented a story where women were first on the scene. It just would have been unthinkable for anyone in the ancient world to concoct a story that rested on believing the evidence of women. The role of women as first witnesses to the empty tomb and resurrection points to the reliability of the gospel accounts. Jesus' resurrection is a believable historical event. And Mark tells us that later the risen Christ rebukes the disciples for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who'd seen him after he'd risen. Well, I hope I've made it clear that Jesus' attitude to women is remarkable, exceptional. It's clear that when Jesus walked the earth, his treatment of women was distinctive. He highlights bias and discrimination, practices inclusion, reaches out to the marginal and disabled. His attitudes run counter to those of any culture. Women from different social backgrounds, from within Israel, from surrounding nations, sat at his feet, listened to his teaching, dialogued, were healed, forgiven, and boldly followed him. He offered life in all his fullness, as he still does, and those women just grabbed it. Jesus' male disciples found his attitude to women unsettling. The religious leaders were incensed, and their reactions provide an indication of the extent to which Jesus' behavior was a departure from the norm. Jesus' attitude to women is just one aspect of his perfect life. No man before or since has ever behaved as he's done. He did. And I often think that only God in the flesh could have behaved in a way that was completely free of sexism. Now, it's important to take a bit of time to process the implications of Jesus' exceptional behavior. We can't just dismiss him as being more enlightened than other first century men. Someone who was kind to women and children, because he claimed to be much more. If you think back to the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, in that conversation with the Samaritan, he claimed to be God. She struggled to understand him. At first, if you're not familiar with that account, I would urge you to read it, maybe this evening. And you'll notice that at first she's very suspicious. She thinks he's up to no good. A bad man. A Jewish man asking her for a drink? Then she seems to think he's a little crazy when he talks about living water. And finally, she comes to the conclusion that he was who he claimed to be, that he was God in the flesh. Bad, mad, or God? Those are the options that faced her. They're the same options that face us. You may have noticed that I refer repeatedly to Luke's Gospel. That's because Luke's Gospel includes so many episodes relating to women that are unique to his Gospel. He mentions women's interactions with Jesus more frequently than any other Gospel. And I know that if you don't have a New Testament, I think there are some New Testaments that you could take one away tonight and perhaps start reading Luke's Gospel and discover for yourself that it really is good news for women. But if you've got some questions, I'm happy for you to ask. I hope I didn't go too fast. And I wasn't drowned out by the musical accompaniment. Oh dear, a stunned silence. You can ask anything. You can be as rude as you like. It's okay. I'm used to students.
Why do you think is patriarchalism still so strong there?
Oh, that's a difficult one to answer. At one time, I was once giving a talk in a British university, and at a time when the feminist movement was a bit more strident than it is today. One of the members of the feminist group in the university challenged me and said, where are the positive examples of women in the church? And it took me back a bit. I mean, I did manage to dredge up, but it made me think I've got to have a better answer to that. So I went away and did some research. And what seemed to happen is that in times when, particularly in the church, when there's a revival in the church, when the church is growing, that women come to the fore. And you see this on so many occasions. So, for instance, it happened in France with the Huguenot women. It was a time of persecution. Actually, that wasn't so much a time... Well, it was a time of revival, but it was also a time of persecution when, after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, so many Huguenot men were imprisoned, killed, or sent to the gallows, and the women took over. I actually went to visit the archives in La Rochelle, and it was so interesting because so many, in the Huguenot archives there, so many women, they're listed, as prédicantes, and in French, when someone, female version has an E on the end. So it's not the same as a woman who's a prédicant, it's a prédicante. So women's ministry was really valued. Well, I could talk about them for a long time, but it's not just there. It was the same. It was the same in Britain during the Methodist revival. One of my heroes is Mary Fletcher. There were a group of women who lived in a farm in Yorkshire, and I mean, people often talk. If you know anything about church history, they often talk about Wesley, who was on his horse every morning, riding all over the place. Preaching the gospel, but the women were the same. They went out, they covered terrific distances. And Mary Fletcher was someone who spoke to crowds of thousands without one of these. Admittedly, it was a time of revival. The same was true in Norway with the Hauge revival during the 19th century. The same has been true in China. So it seems to me, that especially in the church, when it's really vibrant and is growing, that women surface. But then the problem is that, often it settles down and it becomes less of what it should be, and institutionalized, and it becomes more a matter of hierarchy and job descriptions and who does what. And yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have your favorite painting? Do you have?
Well, I like Rembrandt. Yeah. The one I showed you, I've seen it a couple of times. It belongs to, now the King's collection. It's in the Royal Collection. And I've seen it displayed a couple of times. And it's when you see it, you just see, it is so remarkable to get that expression into a face. I mean, somebody has described Rembrandt as the reporter of interior sight. And you've got this terrific psychological depth that he, this person is right on the edge of believing, of having their eyes opened. He's a remarkable painter. But, I like them for different reasons. I actually own one of the paintings I show you now. Oh, yeah, I own that one now. I bought it from Lizzie because I persuaded her to paint something in the exhibition, so I thought, I better buy it. Anyway, I love it. So I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but yeah, she's a good artist.
So are there more women painters nowadays painting biblical illustrations?
Well, I don't know that there are more, but I mean, certainly with that exhibition, it happened in the small market town where we live, which isn't big. I mean, I'm not very good on figures. It's about 10,000 population, you know. So, but it wasn't just it wasn't just artists in the church there. They came from other parts of Wales, and they put out this open call on the internet. So I don't know that there are more, but they're certainly around. I mean, that was a wonderful exhibition. It actually, I mean, Wales isn't a big country. It's, I think our population is a third of that of Serbia. So it went on a tour afterwards, a Welsh tour. You know, we do have some prestigious galleries, but yeah, so it went on a tour to different locations. But it was exciting to see. Yeah. Anybody else like to ask something?
One more question.
Yeah, sure.
What was you were amazed about Jesus' attitude to women, right? It was exceptional. What was like you were amazed through Bible stories or through pictures first, through painting? How did it came?
How did I come to it? Yeah, how did I come to it? Well, a long time ago, when I was doing more speaking in universities, and I was encouraged to write a book responding to the questions that women were asking about the Bible. And as I did it, actually I came across a book by an American called John Phillips about Eve, and he traced the paintings related to Eve. And I realized then that we'd absorbed so many negative messages, especially from Western art, about Eve, because often the serpent was depicted as a mirror image of Eve. I've got a whole lecture on here about it, and it still carries on. There's even a Belgian beer called the Forbidden Fruit, and inside it you've got a version of Cranach's painting of Adam and Eve, where Eve is giving the fruit to Adam, but instead of that they've replaced it with beer. But so it made me think I've got to look at the imagery as well. But so that's where I started thinking about. It's actually there's a department, believe it or not, in Oxford called the Reception History of the Bible, and it looks at the way the Bible has been transmitted in art and music and literature. And I stumbled into one of their meetings one day by mistake. So that's what got me interested in the way things have been depicted culturally. But I started off with the Bible. I started off by being excited about Jesus' treatment of women and the authenticity of it. Yeah. It's called Reception History of the... Well, is it called Reception? I don't know. I get emails from them. I'd have to get on my... I think it's called the Reception History of the Bible. So how it's been received.
It's very interesting how woman was the one represented always as the disobedient one.
Yeah.
The fruit to Adam, who was actually given the responsibility
Exactly.
of creation.
Exactly. I say that in my book.
He did it well,
Well, and there are some, there's some...
I'm the one who's going to guard the...
Yeah, and, the interpretation of that has become a sort of battle of the sexes, because it's, Luther says in his commentary on it that had the serpent tempted the man first, he said, no, shut up, something really. So, where the Bible is silent, generations of commentators have filled in. But to be fair, the same has happened the other way now, that there are really outrageous feminist interpretations of the Bible. So we have to be very careful that we don't bring our cultural blinkers to the scripture when we read it. I mean, I sometimes feel a bit bad doing this when there are men sitting here. I think, I hope I'm not being too hard, not sounding too aggressive. Yeah. Anyway, I should probably stop. But thank you for being such an attentive audience.
You forgot to introduce yourself.
Oh, was I supposed to?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
And maybe, I'm sure everyone would be happy to hear a bit about
Me? Well,
about you.
well, I grew up there on the wild Welsh coast, running wild. I went to university and studied geography, but probably, well, I don't know. No, I am a geographer. But I always had a love of art, and in fact, the art teacher told me at the time, you shouldn't be giving up art, which is probably true. And then what did I? Well, I taught in Switzerland. I worked in a home for disabled children in Switzerland, which was wonderful. Then I went back to Wales and taught. I met my husband. I was going to work with students in Wales for a Christian organisation, like the one you have here in Serbia that works with students. But then I met and married my husband in the meantime, and we went off and studied some theology in Paris. But I became pregnant in the middle of that, so that put pay to my theological education. So if I'm a bit wonky on my theology, it's down to a pregnancy. Then we went back to Wales, and I've always had one foot in student ministry, but have had a job teaching in high school as well. I think that's about it. Oh, but afterwards I went on and studied history of art too. I forgot to say that. Hence the interest in history of art. Yeah.
Advertise your book.
Oh.
Apology to women. Gošća naći na internetu.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the book that you have written, Apology.
Apology to women. Well, it's an apology in both senses of the word. An apology that, in the interpretation of the Bible, woman has obviously often been denigrated in the past, but it's an apology in the sense of being an apologia or a defense of the Bible that, properly understood, properly read, it has a high view of women. And it was basically trying to take the questions that people asked and reply to them. So that was it, really.
One more question. So, if the Bible, especially in New Testament, tells us that Jesus took women very seriously and valued them, and why do you think that this battle between men and women in church is still going on?
I think it's tragic. I really do. I think, you know, when you look at the early church, you have the impression that, it was a really exciting time. The church was growing very quickly, and you look at the Apostle Paul. He speaks very highly of women. You know, the end of his letter to the church in Rome, enormous number of women that he commends as being, in different ways. He calls women fellow workers, not just there, but in Philippians too. He calls those two women who've had some disagreement of some sort. Again, he calls them co-workers. But we're not given neat job descriptions. We don't know exactly what they were doing. It seems that both men and women were involved in communicating the gospel. There are two difficult passages, of course, in Paul. One in 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2, which have been made to bear enormous weight. There are different interpretations of them. The problem being that in each case we don't know properly the context into which Paul was writing. In each case there are particular difficulties in the text, particularly in 1 Timothy 2, where a word is used for having authority, authentine, which is the only time that it's used in the New Testament. He doesn't use the normal exousian. So they are very problematic texts. But people who want to have a very conservative view, major on those texts. I think the sad thing is that too often it's become a matter of position and hierarchy and who does what. I don't have an easy answer. I just think it's tragic. Well, if you want to go and join whatever's happening there that sounds a bit livelier.
Okay, if there is no more questions, I'm sure that you have enjoyed this presentation and very inspiring, and that you will have the rest of the evening that you will digest what you have heard and seen. I'm sure you agree that Anne deserves one big applaud from us. It was very, very inspiring and very unique presentation. And thank you, Anne, for hard work and for traveling all the way from Wales here to present this beautiful talk to us. If you are interested and you have enjoyed it and you have time to come tomorrow, Anne will speak again, but on a different place, and that will be in George Bar in Despota Stefana 41 at 6:00 p.m. tomorrow. And the theme will be Believe the Woman. Is there evidence for the resurrection credible? So she has mentioned today something about Mary Magdalene being a first witness to Christ's resurrection, and how she was unbelieved by disciples. And she will be talking more about that tomorrow. So you are absolutely welcome to join and tomorrow. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation.
I must say, it's great to be here because... Oh, sorry, forgot. It's great to be here because my husband has visited Serbia many times and says how wonderful it is, and it's my first time, so it's great to be here. Thank you.